In really urban areas, with the Great Lakes in particular, those are great source introduction points for many invasive species. Every year, too, we see a new great kind of viral capture of a goldfish. Koi are another good example of a species that are kind of well kept. And again, to your point, kind of people come to the maybe end of their relationship with their pet and, are looking for to do right by that animal in a sense and have the best of intentions.
What has happened with mothballs, and this is just recent, that this has kind of been happening, but zebra mussels have actually been found on mothballs, which are typically used by aquarium hobbyists in aquarium settings. And so zebra mussels will be attached to the mothballs, and unintending consumers will come and purchase those mothballs, and subsequent release can kind of take place after they've been purchased.
Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin. This is episode number 121. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Today I'm speaking with Colin, Cassin, and Jenna White of the Invasive Species Centre out of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada. In the episode, we discussed the work that the Invasive Species Centre does. We discussed the magnitude of the problem of the invasive species in Canada. So this is not just reptile related, but we're talking about plants, aquatic plants, fish, and reptiles and mammals as well. So Colin and Jenna give us a few examples of invasive species that are currently exist in Canada. And then we also discuss their Don't Let It Loose campaign. And this is where it really applies to myself and the listeners to the podcast. Everybody listening, unless you're brand new to the show, knows that this podcast is centered around responsible and ethical keeping of pets. And this is one of those major points that we really need to take responsibility for. That is unintentional and intentional release of pets, whether that's fish, reptiles, and aquatic plants is another big one. And I know almost everybody listening to this podcast knows how obvious it is not to release an animal into the wild. Whether we live in frozen Canada or in Florida, it can have a major impact on the natural ecosystem. But part of being associated with a group of people like herpetoculture, reptile keepers, or animal keepers in general, it is our responsibility as, I hesitate to use the word higher level keepers, but would say people who are focused on responsible keeping. Part of our job is to make sure that we're educating new keepers that you cannot release animals into the wild, and also have a spot for those animals that are no longer wanted. As we know, that's really common in reptile or pet keeping in general. People go and impulsively buy an animal and then suddenly no longer want it. It should be up to us to make sure that we have a space for those animals to come back to in a good captive setting that isn't going to be released into the wild. So we discussed the Don't Let It Loose campaign, and then a few other examples of invasive species that might surprise you, and invasive species that can be linked to the pet trade that are causing havoc in some of the lake systems and the water systems here in Canada as well as the United States. So I think this is just a really great reminder for us who try to be responsible and ethical when it comes to keeping, of another thing that we can do to make sure that we are good standing members in our community, to make sure that we are promoting the right message and making sure the new people that are coming into the hobby have the right tools and the right information so they make the right choices. If you're looking for any more information on this episode today, head to animalsathomenetwork.com. There you'll find links to everything that has been mentioned in today's podcast. If you are interested in joining us on Patreon, you can head to patreon.com/animalsathome. There you'll have early access to the episodes, the opportunity to submit questions to upcoming guests, and monthly or every 4 or 5 weeks or so, our keeper chats on Zoom, where we get everybody in on Zoom, myself and Liam from Reptiles and Research, and we just chat reptiles. It's kind of like a virtual herp society almost, and it's a blast. So if you want to be part of that, you can head to patreon.com/animalsathome. Thank you so much to CustomReptileHabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. You can find affiliate links in both the YouTube description as well as the show notes. That means if you do click them and make a purchase, a small commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And there is an exciting project coming with Custom Reptile Habitats in this space relatively soon, so make sure you're watching into the springtime. We're going to do a nice little video there. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, we did have our baby. We have a baby boy. He's actually just sitting on the floor right there on a little pad. Sebastian, he's healthy. Everything is going really well. Sleeping is intermittent. So I'm hoping to fall back onto a relatively normal podcast schedule. This is being released on Sunday. That's my normal schedule. I already have one recorded for next week, but as I'm finding out, my schedule is no longer my own. So sometimes things happen where I can't get the podcast edited. So I may end up just falling into, rather than going every single week, just getting the podcast out when it's edited and then falling back into that normal weekly schedule when I have the time. So maybe instead of going every single Sunday, maybe I might post an episode midweek or something like that. I'm still working on it, but I do have some amazing episodes lined up. So if you do want to know more about that, you can find us on Patreon to learn more. And I think that's it. That's all the housekeeping for today. Let's jump into the episode. Enjoy. Well, Colin and Jenna, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is exciting.
Yeah, I'm very excited. This is a topic that surrounds the pet keeping industry. Obviously, something that we talk about a lot in the States because that's an explosion of an issue, especially in the southern states. But it really is a problem everywhere, and it's one of those marks on the animal keeping hobby and the animal keeping trade that we do want to make sure that we're paying attention to and being responsible for. And we're going to get into all that. I want to break that down a lot further. But before we do that, clearly you guys have a job that surrounds yourself with nature, and I assume that there's a love for nature. So why don't you just give the listeners a quick background on where your love for nature came from, if you can remember where that came from. Maybe we'll start with Colin.
Yeah, Dylan, happy to. So my love for nature, I think, comes out of gardening and goofing around on lakes in the summer and playing around in some of our natural resources. And was fortunate enough to understand what a really weedy lake looks like at a young age and how challenging that can be for swimming. And always thought of it from an icky and yucky perspective until I realized most of those weeds that I was so concerned with that were preventing me from swimming in some of those of my favorite lakes were invasive aquatic plants. So that set me up nicely for a journey on realizing some of the impacts of invasive species.
Yeah. Well, me being a swimmer for almost my whole life, swimming in crystal clear pools, the seaweed or any stuff touching my feet always freaked me out, but it's so true. And I can't wait to get into the aquatic plant side of things because that's something that people definitely don't think about. And Jenna, what about yourself?
Yeah, similar. Always had an interest in the environment and nature growing up. Did a lot of camping, which led to a job in provincial parks, which was also a really foundational kind of aspect to my life that made me really want to pursue kind of work in the environment. And actually in that park, we had an invasive species, the emerald ash borer, go through and kind of decimate the whole campground, which was really kind of upsetting to see. It's one of the places that I really loved. So that kind of motivated me to join the ISC, but also just in terms of personal interest. Yeah, always camping, always hiking, love being in the water as well. So it's something that's always been near and dear to my heart. So yeah.
What species was it that you said that ripped through the campground?
The emerald ash borer, it took down we had to take down a lot of trees. They ended up being fairly hazardous in the campgrounds, but also the beach bark disease went through a couple years before that. So it was really challenging to have all that happen in the park in the span of a couple years and to really see the impact on the forest there.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think we're so fortunate to be in Canada is we have so much beautiful landscape and we do have a lot of nature that's been preserved, but it becomes super evident when something happens and a disease rips through or, sometimes we see like black knot on the trees and take down a bunch of beautiful forest it definitely leaves a mark for sure. So let's talk about the Invasive Species Centre and maybe we can just give people a quick background on the organization's history. How did it pop up? Maybe Colin, you could take that.
Yeah. I'm happy to tell the quick version. So it's a not-for-profit organization, the Invasive Species Centre. It's based in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, but we do work across Canada and work on all types of invasive species, whether it's species that are near and dear to hobbyists, whether they're pond enthusiasts or what have you, or maybe more natural species that we'd find in the natural environment, like Jenna referenced, the emerald ash borer. So we've been around for a little bit more than 10 years. We're just into our 11th year now, our second decade, based in the Soo and working all across Canada. So, some of our programs we work in are things related to keeping Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, which is a really important up and coming group of species that are going to be, I think, very much on the radar in the years ahead in Canada. We've worked a little bit on emerald ash borer and other forest pests, like Jenna mentioned before, some things that kind of impact our provincial parks or national parks or our forests all across Canada. And we work in terrestrial environments, aquatic environments, you name it, where they're kind of focused in on connecting people around invasive species, whether they're researchers or people working within different levels of government on policy, or people out there doing the hard work of getting rid of some of these species once they establish. Trying to see ourselves as a bit of a hub and connection point to make sure that people are talking to each other, exchanging resources and information wherever they can, and ultimately doing a better job at preventing the spread of invasive species across Canada.
Yeah, it seems like such a rat's nest of a problem in some ways. I mean, because of how complex ecosystems are, and we start to see how difficult it can be to unweave an invasive species once it has established. So for both of you, and maybe we'll go to Jenna first, is what motivated you to actually, I mean, you did mention with having some experience there, but what motivated you to go to the Invasive Species Centre and start working there? How did you encounter it in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of tied in well with my 5-year plan, I suppose, initially. But I actually, like I mentioned, invasive species really do have a strong impact on a lot of our, recreational activities and just our social and cultural kind of appreciation for, the planet. So I guess those two examples I mentioned earlier were kind of the strongest points that I really realized how invasive species impact my recreation and my personal kind of enjoyment of these areas. But outside of that, I mean, I am an animal lover as well. And it is really hard to see these kind of things happen to environments where there are no voices. And it felt strongly about joining the ISC to kind of protect these environments, just based on basically those two major species really drew me in. Yeah.
And Colin, what about for yourself? Was there a moment where you just were motivated to go work with invasive species, or?
Yeah, earthworms, funny enough, are actually my gateway species into this.
Wow.
A species we're all so familiar with, right? Like walking down a sidewalk after a rainy day, it's something you can't avoid. And earthworms, interestingly enough, although they're very good for soils of modified environments, or vermicomposting and all sorts of great reasons to love and appreciate earthworms, fishing bait for instance too, but they are actually invasive. Nearly all, I think 17 of our 19 species in Ontario at least, and this holds true as a general trend across Canada more broadly, are all invasive. So even though we're so familiar with them and in many cases digging through the garden at an early age and doing some backyard vegetable gardening, for instance, you become really accustomed with them. So this has kind of been a bit of a pathway into realizing, although we're familiar with them, they do have negative consequences on the environment. So, some of those consequences are munching through leaf litter layer in forest environments and kind of making some of our deciduous forests more prone to drought. When they don't have that kind of cushy leaf litter layer there because the worms have consumed them all. And so when I kind of came across that realization during my undergrad, it kind of pivoted maybe how I'm looking at the world around me and what our human impacts are. So it just became kind of a subject matter that was just of pretty high interest for me.
Yeah, it's really amazing. There's a lot of people that don't believe me when I say the earthworm is actually invasive. And I think maybe it's been here for a long, like this came with the European settlers, right? Is that how far back the earthworm was traced to coming to North America, or?
Yeah, and its introduction, exactly. So ship ballast, which is kind of just the weight. We used to use soil, now we use water. But for kind of transoceanic shipping routes, we used to load them up just to kind of buoy some of those ships down a little bit. And once you cross the pond and you get to more inland water systems and you need a little bit, you don't want to be sinking quite as deep, you'd unload some of that ballast onto the shore. So you'd shovel off some of that soil, and with some of that soil came earthworms. And so, early 1800s, late 1700s is really when most of those kind of introductions for worms came about. And then we've seen subsequent spread from there on. So there's a number of other pathways that earthworms are moving around, whether it's through live bait. Many people in Canada use live bait. Some provinces restrict it, but you might go buy a dozen earthworms and go fishing with them. And what some people will do is make the decision, if they've only used 10 of those 12 worms in that bucket, just toss them into the garden or into the forest, or just beside the boat launch on your way out of the water body. And what we've seen, that's a great example of a pathway for how, species can crawl around, spread further from there, and really kind of have unintended consequences. By well-intentioned people, I'll just throw the earthworms aside once I'm done on the water. But unfortunately, those unpredicted or unknown consequences after that, which is when they would spread off into the forest native ecosystems and have impacts on those native species that call that home.
Well, and it's funny because I think a lot of times, especially being in Canada, we think we're shielded from invasive species just because of how cold the winters get. But really, in reality, a lot of these species are so hardy; they have no issue with the winters, and even species that don't necessarily come from as cold of a climate.
That's the tricky thing, right? Yeah, and most of the species that we have as invasive in Canada are coming from kind of similar enough climates globally, more or less within a reasonable range. So, a lot of these species, if we trace back where their native ranges, usually we're going to comparable climates in Europe and Asia. And yeah, it's true. We're losing in many cases those kind of critical cold stretches over the winter. We still have, a fair share, of course, but those long durations of extreme cold climate or cold temperatures, they can really have a good effect on reducing the spread or slowing down the spread into boreal systems and more northern environments. For things like forest pests, and we just don't have that same backstop support that we used to kind of slow down the spread further. So it's another example of a bit of a challenge we face in how these critters and pathogens and insects and diseases are moving around.
So can you just give us a brief rundown or a broad rundown of the type of work that the Invasive Species Centre does, just as a couple examples?
Yeah, Jen, I'll maybe lead off and then I'll turn it over to you if that's okay. So we've got a few program areas, Dylan, that we work in. Some side of things, traditionally, we've worked a lot in forest pests. So Jenna spoke about emerald ash borer earlier, and that's a great example of a species we've been working on for a while. There's quite a few forest pests that we have in Canada or threatening to come to Canada. Things like oak wilt is a new disease that's knocking on our border. I think it's 500 meters or 490 something meters from the Ontario border. So it's as close as could be coming from the States. And that's a disease that impacts oak species. So oak trees, native trees that are really important for pollinators and other things. So we've worked at a few forest pests and trying to promote some of our kind of key partners and stakeholders, whether they're government agencies or whether they're arborists or urban foresters, just to be aware of those species, know how to identify those species so that hopefully we can find them early if and when they do show up, and then have a adequate response after that can be effective. So we've worked a lot in forest pests, and we've also worked a lot too in some of the aquatic species. So I mentioned before, Asian Carp Canada is a program that we run with some other partners, with some partners at the federal government too, through Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And that's a really important project that aims to make people more aware of what Asian carp are. It's a group of 4 species that aren't currently established in the Great Lakes and in Canada, but if they were ever work to become established, they'd be really problematic for a variety of reasons.
Are they the species that there's all those viral videos in the States, and it was in the Mississippi where they're just jumping out of the water? That's Asian carp, right?
Yeah. So 4 species of carp, when we kind of bin them together under the term Asian carp, and one of them, silver carp, is the one that jumps out. So when you've got that surface disruption, whether it's somebody just paddling along the river or you're taking the tin boat out going fishing, that's that kind of automatic response the fish have in numbers, in tens and hundreds and even thousands if you're in the right part of the water body, just jumping out and pouring into the boat. So really something that are interesting to see on those videos, great viral videos for sure. But just when you experience them firsthand, you realize this is not something we want in Canadian waters by any means. So a really problematic thing to try and keep out of our waterways. And prevention is really the key on that species. If we can prevent them from coming, it's a much more cost-effective approach and we can have a high chance of success. But for all these species, if they were to become established, kind of turning back time is really difficult to do and requires massive resources if we even ever could turn back the time on some of these established invasives. So, really the time is now to keep some of these species in check.
And Jenna, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, pretty much just to echo Colin, I guess our framework is kind of centered on early detection, rapid response, and prevention, which again, more cost effective. So I think we kind of operate under the prevention kind of framework for the most part, especially as Colin mentioned with the CARP program, which I work with closely. And so this is kind of, again, just to ensure that we're kind of stopping the problem before it becomes a problem here. So, and as we've kind of alluded to before, invasive species see no boundaries. So that's kind of our main issue, is that they are able to just move around freely without kind of being impeded. And so that's what we look to prevent.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, with Florida being the example of like the worst case scenario of just like a motley crew of different species from all over the different world or all over different parts of the world, how bad is the invasive species problem in Canada, for example? Like I said, we don't often think about it, but there are invasive species, and so how big of a problem do we have?
It's such a good point, Dylan, you raised. And because, back to the earlier point about how, we kind of select in a sense, not on purpose, but just our climate enables certain kinds of species or species from certain geographic areas or with certain life history traits to do really well. Places that have comparable enough climates to Canada, provide the right conditions, right? And so when we look over at other examples, islands, kind of along the equator, if we're thinking about Florida, other, warm environments tend to just by nature have a higher opportunity for more species to come in and kind of recap it. So in a sense, we have a little bit of a built-in advantage there compared to islands, compared to kind of Central America or Florida or any other kind of, comparable climates in the world. And that, we have a little bit of an advantage in that sense, but unfortunately, it's not enough of an advantage. We still have quite a few species and pathways of species finding their way here and becoming established, kind of wreaking havoc either ecologically or just economically too. Emerald ash borer is a great example of a species that can impact, municipalities and those on kind of the pointy end of the stick who kind of have to be forced to engage in controlling some of these species, and they can become really quite expensive. So the city of Toronto spends more than $10 million a year at its peak on emerald ash borer control.
Wow.
Yeah, because so many of those trees are being lost in kind of, they're urban trees, street trees with lots of personal property, cars and people around, and they require a response in many conditions and many situations. And, that would be a very early example of emerald ash borer finding the city of Toronto, and it's a species that's moving west and march well west. Since then through Ontario, through Manitoba, as well as we're going west. So, it applies on the terrestrial side. It applies on the aquatic side too. Zebra mussels are a really costly species to deal with. We're thinking about aquatic invasive species too. So it's one we're focused in on. We've got a built-in advantage. We want to kind of identify all the pathways and all the ways that these invasive species move around within Canada now that we have that opportunity. So there's a few examples of really good kind of small reasonable actions we could take and things we could do to kind of make sure that we have a happier invasive species story to tell in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously the people listening to this podcast are two types of people. Most of them are animal keepers and keep pets, but they are all nature lovers. And I think everybody wants to be responsible with the animals that they keep in their home and making sure that we're absolutely not contributing to the invasive species problem. And I do want to talk about, because as you'd already kind of mentioned, there are other ways species become invasive that has nothing to do with people keeping pets, throwing the worms out after fishing and whatnot. But roughly what percentage in Canada could be linked, invasive species could be linked to people actually releasing pets or just pet keeping in general?
It's really tough to say. I wish we had a solid bit of data and concrete evidence to point to. I think it's mostly just anecdotal when we come across the key species and the priority species that we come across strong links into the hobbyist industries, pet keeping and water gardens and kind of, more broadly from there too. I think there's some great opportunities with species that we probably wouldn't have traditionally associated with aquarium keeping and hobbyists. I think there's a good example maybe we'll chat about in a little bit about zebra mussels coming in through moss balls. And, we might not have thought zebra mussels and aquarium keeping are strong links because, of course, nobody's going to want to keep zebra mussels. But, we'll tell the story in a little bit more detail later on, Dylan. But basically, the short version is that moss balls with, a great addition to an aquarium ended up being kind of a cover for zebra mussels moving around unknowingly through a pet trade. So there's a few great examples of kind of anecdotes of species like that we would love to kind of work with the pet keeping industry and hobbyists more broadly about, what kind of solutions we could do for good, responsible pet keeping to make sure that this as a pathway is mitigated.
Yeah, and one of the, I think, almost a poster child of an invasive species is the goldfish, right? You see these giant goldfish in the lakes, and there was a viral video not that long ago of a little girl with like a toy fishing rod catching, I don't know, maybe it was even in one of the Great Lakes, catching a giant goldfish, and you can kind of see where people have sympathy for the fish. They don't want it anymore, but they don't want to euthanize it, so they just chuck it in the water, thinking it's not a big deal. But like using goldfish as an example, How is there a substantial population of goldfish living in the Great Lakes right now, or is this more of like a rare occurrence?
Yeah, Jenna, I'll lead and then I'll turn over to you if that's okay. I wish it was more rare, Dylan. Yeah, that's kind of the challenge, right? Is we've certainly seen, especially Lake Ontario being a great example, and kind of Hamilton Harbor. So the farther I guess west part of the lake, we've seen in really urban areas, with the Great Lakes in particular, those are great source introduction points for many invasive species. Every year, too, we see a new great kind of viral capture of a goldfish. Koi are another good example of a species that are kind of well kept. And again, to your point, kind of people come to the maybe end of their relationship with their pet, and are looking for to do right by that animal in a sense, and have the best of intentions in place, but then kind of unfortunately make a poor decision in releasing that into the natural environment. So we do see lots of kind of urban, especially on the Great Lakes, kind of, coastal wetlands being home, unfortunately, to species like goldfish. Not all that rare. If we're going out goldfish, hunting for goldfish, or looking for goldfish, I should say, in our urban environments, stormwater ponds are kind of municipal water intake or storage facilities on the landscape are also really good sources of looking for species like that, whether it's goldfish as a great example, koi or red-eared slider, or any number of other kind of usual well-kept species. Just more population density around natural environments tends to be where we would go out and find those species in high abundance. What do you think, Jenna?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that there's obviously a significant kind of correlation between this the urban populations and the species that we find in the water that have been released by pet owners, and I think this is due to the convenience of it. As Colin mentioned, kind of storm ponds in Alberta are a good example of that. Some of the storm ponds that exist behind subdivisions tend to have kind of large populations of goldfish, and this has kind of pushed out any other native species that might have existed there previously. And so this is where kind of the problem is most obvious. But as well as Colin mentioned, Hamilton Harbor in Lake Ontario area seem to have kind of significant populations as well. And the problem being too that they grow to these enormous sizes because they're able to kind of eat all the food and outcompete the native species that are there. And this is kind of the problem that we're looking to prevent here.
Yeah, and I know, with red-eared sliders, as you mentioned as well, Colin, it's a very similar problem. And I think one of the things that I didn't even really think about until I was sort of doing some research for this episode is people will release animals into these like retention ponds and whatnot, and they don't realize how connected those can be to other waterways, right? They just see it as this pond in their backyard, and they think, well, that's just an isolated thing. But it's amazing how small culvert systems or drainage systems, how quickly animals can spread throughout an entire area and then get into the actual the native population, into the lakes and whatnot through these things that seemingly aren't connected just by the sort of the layman.
It's a great point. Yeah, we might look at those stormwater management ponds not being as the most pristine of natural environments, but yeah, absolutely, the connectedness of them is just remarkable, right? And that's kind of what we've started to come across with unfortunately a high frequency of examples here. Is just about, although they might seem like isolated functions and features, I guess, on the landscape, just their connectedness to those natural water bodies is really challenging. And actually, Jenna brought up a great kind of anecdote about a story coming out of Alberta that I think really illustrates the story perfectly. So there's a stormwater pond in behind the subdivision in St. Albert, Alberta. And a couple years ago, it became very much on the radar of the local municipality and the provincial government about just how abundant goldfish were. And this particular pond really has a lot of kind of community value. It's there's kind of small fishing areas as well. It's kind of, that ecological gem, I guess, in a very urban environment. And so, once they were so widely established, those goldfish and koi, and kind of out competing some of those native species that might be fished there more frequently for recreational anglers or just kind of people out, taking advantage of a really nice urban a bit of nature. The municipality and the province came in, they used a chemical called rotenone just to kind of almost hit reset in effect of trying to remove all of those goldfish and invasive species from the pond. And we're able to restock and kind of rebuild a bit of a more healthy environment after the fact. And I think the really interesting part of that story and that anecdote, from my perspective at least, is we've got a report from a local angler there who was using that pond once it had been kind of restocked and replenished without goldfish, of course, present. And he saw somebody coming down the hill, walking up to the pond with a couple of large, like 5-gallon buckets in hand. And he, took the ownership and onus to kind of just go up and have a conversation with the person, see, this is a bit of an unusual sight. Why are you walking down to the water with a couple of pails? And realized very quickly that the gentleman had some goldfish and that was going to, do what somebody presumably had done years before, introduce goldfish into that pond. And, thank goodness for that angler, because I was able to have that conversation and just inform that gentleman that just some of the consequences that releasing goldfish or any other organism trade into that pond could have on that kind of ecological gem, that little bit of green within a suburban context. And thankfully was able to prevent another release of those species into the pond. And so, all the restocked fish and kind of other bits and pieces of the environment that use that pond were able to kind of have benefit and continue to coexist beyond that. So a really nice, good, I think, story that articulates kind of, what could happen, how much effort is involved in restoring some of these systems if they do become established with some of these invasive species, and also the importance of what just a small conversation or each of us kind of taking the onus to have the conversation can do in terms of benefiting the native species that are present in our environment.
Well, and that's a really interesting example, because the opportunity there to reset was an option, where in the natural environment you cannot do that, and to sort of wipe the slate clean and then restock it, that's amazing. And then the anglers will notice obviously that the fish are coming back. But especially in Manitoba and Ontario, because we have so many tiny lakes, like thousands and thousands of little lakes, it's so common for people to go stock lakes with bass, and maybe a lake 20 kilometers south has bass in it naturally, but this lake doesn't, and people go, I want a bass fish over here, and they'll bring a bunch of a fry of bass or whatever, and then in 5-10 years there's just the bass have just decimated everything, and the rest of the fish can't compete. And it just shows you how the balance is just, it's very finicky, and you can, one species that you think should be there because it's in another lake just down the road can completely offset everything.
Exactly right. And the best of intentions, I'd like to use this natural resource for this particular use, and therefore I want to introduce this species. Although coming from a well-intentioned place, to your point there, just about that delicate balance of these systems. And, even if we have a species that's, broadly native to Canada or native to your particular province, we're just introducing it in a system or in a particular environment where it may not have become established. And, even that small little movement of kilometers or tens of kilometers, really can expand the range of particular species. So it's a delicate balance. That's why, kind of generally speaking, not introducing or not moving species, whether it's in aquatic environments and we're moving minnows or live bait from one lake to another, or moving firewood from one municipality to another, just generally not moving species as best we reasonably can is really a great kind of guiding principle, I find, in our line of work.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the Don't Let It Loose campaign, because this is something that I believe both of you are spearheading, and it goes well with the people listening to the podcast, and how responsible we can be as not only pet owners, but as you said, as we move through the environment, we have to make sure that we're not spreading things as well. So did one of you want to just sort of explain the initiative, just give us a broad sense of it? I'm not sure who would want to take that.
Yeah, I'm happy to hit lead off, Jen. I don't want to control the conversation too much, so I'll turn it over to you, and whenever you like, just give me the signal to stop yakking away here. But Dylan, where we're trying to go with this is Don't Let It Loose has been some good guidance, some good wording that we've seen used kind of by some of our provinces and federal government for a few years now, and just with this idea of releasing, intentionally releasing pet species into the natural environment, even if well-intentioned, is just generally just not a good idea. There's too many great examples of success stories of species being released and establishing themselves in ways that really aren't particularly helpful to the natural environment. So we've been trying to use this wording for a couple of years now, and one particular campaign we're working on early in 2022 when we're speaking here, is this idea of just trying to work within as many of our potential partners as possible to get this wording across and make sure that people understand the importance of just not letting their hobby species loose on the environment here. And I think we recognize the role of pet keepers and hobbyists of kind of a wide swath, and the role that they can play in terms of not letting some of these species loose into our environments. And so, this is us trying to connect in with this audience and just kind of, further get this message across here about, the potential consequences, I guess, really of releasing some of these species into the environment. Mm-hmm. So, part of this campaign is us working with some partners here to try and get that messaging across. And we've got a few good upcoming events and kind of key dates on the calendar that we're looking forward to. So in late February and into early March 2022, we've got a campaign we're participating in called Invasive Species Awareness Week. And this is kind of a pretty broad-reaching campaign all across Canada. We've got participants even from the US as well. Just kind of shared messaging on invasive species, talking about it. So you might see some content coming across online on some of our social channels, just talking about the role of invasive species and the consequences of if we are to release them into the natural environment, some of the damage it can cause to species at risk or other beneficial critters on the landscape. So we've been working with this messaging, don't let it loose. It can be pretty broadly applied, whether you're interested in kind of the fish keeping side of things, water gardens and keeping aquatic plants, keeping reptiles and everything in between. There's kind of a good connection in with this language of don't let it loose into whatever your particular species of interest or taxonomic group of interest might be. Jenna, what do you think?
Oh yeah, just to back up a tad bit there. I think the don't let it loose kind of slogan is also all encompassing of the few pathways that we've kind of discussed. Obviously the pet release one. But also it touches on the idea of e-commerce, purchasing like species online that could be invasive where you're purchasing it, maybe not where you're purchasing it from. So we're kind of trying to touch on a few different pathways, including also as well sport fish, live food, water garden kind of species. So they kind of all fall into this category of not letting those species loose unintentionally or intentionally. So that's just kind of a little bit of background as well on the pathway itself.
Yeah, and it's funny. We'll get into the unintentional release in a bit because that's kind of a fascinating side. Colin had already mentioned the moss balls and whatnot. But as far as the intentional release goes, I think many people, especially in the herpetoculture, who are keeping reptiles, who are more advanced keepers, we'll call them. It's so obvious not to do that. Like it's just an obvious thing, but it's us that needs to be giving that message because it's these new keepers that come in or people who aren't really understanding the commitment or the responsibility that they're taking on when they get a new animal. And then suddenly they aren't really, I always call these people that they're not necessarily part of herpetoculture. They go to the pet store and they buy a snake or they buy a reptile or a turtle and they don't interact with the community really. They might be a birthday present or some sort of impulse purchase and they're not interacting with the greater community and learning these things that are so important. And I think it's our job as the hobbyists, the people who are responsible to be continuously giving this message and making sure that when we're introducing new people to the hobby, we have to actually say don't release it. And for us, because it seems so obvious, so I think we sometimes forget. But I could also easily put myself in a situation, maybe you're like 14 or 15 and you have a turtle and you just don't want to care for it anymore and you see a bunch of turtles in the pond that look similar. Why not just let it go? And it's so important that people understand why that's really bad. So as far as the target audience, are you guys trying to hit the keepers, the retailers, and the breeders, or is there a specific target that you're aiming for?
Yeah, I think we're in the past we've really tried to work with some of the retail locations. I mean, just by kind of nature of this sector in this industry, it's a little bit challenging just outside of the kind of big box opportunities in terms of mass. Like that's our first step here is just trying to get some of this language and messaging up on some of their websites or ideally distributed through some of their staff. And I think, one of the challenging points is getting down to maybe those more local or higher specialization points of sale. as well as Jenna mentioned there, just kind of this online trade is through e-commerce is a bit of a challenge for us to kind of reach into. So really we do rely most importantly probably on the well-informed and well-intended and well-educated folks within the hobbyist sector. It's just trying to help us get some of that messaging across. So we've taken the opportunity to kind of engage with some of the good places where people tend to go, find their way into some of these communities, whether it's kind of key social media groups, high volume Facebook groups, things like that. Just trying to get some of the messaging across in those platforms has been really helpful for us, as well as just reaching out to kind of some other mediums and other channels as well. It's just been a good chance for us to try and reach a little bit farther beyond that point of sale, which is traditionally where we've gone to, but also just find people about where they're finding their connection. I mean, one of the challenges in trying to find the right mediums to reach our audiences too is just there are certainly formal channels that people go to get their supplies, their equipment, their species, their pets. There's also less formal channels too, of course, right? Whether it's Kijiji or whether it's kind of just like more.
Right.
It dates me to say classified ads, but something like that. But just other channels that are maybe less organized and less traditional. So we're taking a bit of a two-pronged approach there, try and reach point of sale for sure, but also look for other mechanisms that people are going to get their information and trying to work with them in those spaces as well.
Well, and I think from the hobbyist point of view, it's our job to make sure that we can absorb animals that are no longer wanted. Like that's a really big key. And I mean, there's rescues and whatnot that are always full because for that exact reason. But we do have to, even if I would never release an animal, almost we need to have this sort of sense of responsibility over all the animals that are in captivity. And if there's somebody that doesn't want one anymore, we need to absorb it back into a captive setting that's not going to be an intentional release. And do you guys have a grasp on why somebody would release a pet? Is it just, there's too many different options? I mean, obviously there's expenses and whatnot, but is there one reason or a couple of reasons that stand out as why somebody might, throw a goldfish into a pond?
Yeah, we come across a few. I would say, generally I find one of the first descriptions on why people think it's an okay thing to do is just maybe a lack of information. So I think we're trying to approach them with that information as being a tool that can support them. There's many consequences out there of releasing some of these species into the natural environment. We've talked about a few, but it's negative impacts to species at risk or other native species that would use those. Maybe it's moving around diseases and or pathogens or parasites or other kind of things that would kind of jump from those introduced species into native species as well. And so it's not just about releasing the challenges of releasing those species that might be invasive, but even if we had a native species that's kind of been bred in captivity or kept in captivity for a while and, releasing that in and amongst the same species, there's just a lot of unintended consequences there too. And so there's no shortage of reasons why it's not necessarily a great idea. Then I find usually in our conversations, it tends to be just a lack of thinking that through. And, to relate this into my own personal experience too, it was kind of that earthworm eureka moment for me, right? Just being so familiar with the species, not really thinking about those consequences of dumping that bait bucket at the side of the boat launch and not really understanding that, those can crawl into the natural environment, become invasive, have negative consequences. And so, just when that information reached me, I was able to kind of modify my practices or change what do I do with my bait? And so I think it's kind of a analogous story here into, our conversations with hobbyists generally and pet keeping more broadly. It's just the first thing here is I didn't really think of it that way is usually the first response we get back. So, I think generally that's the kind of first thing we're trying to approach here is trying to get that information out for the first time, make people a little bit more aware. And I think that, there's other rationales and reasons too. I think people tend to approach it from a compassionate grounds perspective, which is quite a reasonable take. And I think it really helps us inform our own decision making and how we're communicating when we understand that perspective a little bit more. And I have a lot of appreciation for it. Had some great conversations. I'm sure, Jenna, maybe you have too, just around realizing that perspective and people maybe becoming very close to the pet over time. And that's a difficult decision for them to kind of reach their end of their relationship with that. And they want to see the best for that pet moving forward. And maybe then they kind of make the jump into well, setting it free would be an advisable thing. I think usually when we have that conversation with folks, I try and spin it on its head a little bit more and have that conversation with people just about completely understand the compassionate perspective. And it's very ethical in a sense, that mentality. But what I would turn it on its head is say, the negative consequences of that individual then interacting with all the individuals and other species it would come across in that natural setting. That's also a factor, I think, in coming to your ethical decision. And how you're going to release it, and just respecting the fact that releasing that one individual may be good for that individual, but what are the consequences to all those other critters, all across the taxonomic groups that would call that habitat home, and the negative consequences that it could have on those. Jenna, does that kind of line up with your thinking on it and some of the interactions you have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just a kind of key thing that we kind of keep coming across is age and lack of knowledge on age of animals, that they end up growing to be a lot older than people kind of anticipate. And this ends up being a longer time commitment. And so this is kind of, I guess, an underlying kind of purpose for these releases, is that people were not kind of anticipating the growth and like I say, the time commitment that comes alongside owning these pets, the financial commitments. And so this kind of turns to, you do have that compassionate sense for these creatures, but at the same time, it's like Colin says, it's an individual versus an entire ecosystem. So it is sad to see that being kind of a leading cause for this, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I really try to push with this podcast, because it's really bad in the reptile hobby, is people keeping animals that get just too big. And it's kind of a fad almost. I shouldn't say it's a fad, but it's kind of a cool thing to have big snakes. And in reality, many people can't, don't have space, or tortoises or turtles are a great example. Red-eared slider is a great example of an animal that gets a lot bigger than people think when you buy it, the size of a quarter. And not only is it going to live for 40 or 50 years, it's also going to get giant, and you're not going to have space for it. And part of that is the animal hobby really needing to direct it towards animals that make ethical sense to keep in captivity, and not just the species that we think are cool. And what are some, I think Colin had already mentioned a few examples of unintentional releases. Are there any, Jenna, do you have any other examples, or either of you can jump in, of unintentional releasing of an animal or a species? Because I think that's kind of a fascinating side that people don't often think about.
Yeah, I can touch on it. I'll start, but I think we were going to kind of discuss this issue with moss balls. That's kind of our key story for the unintentional release. And so, what has happened with moss balls, and this is just recent, that this has kind of been happening, but zebra mussels have actually been found on moss balls, which are typically used by aquarium hobbyists in aquarium settings. And so zebra mussels will be attached to the moss balls, and unintending consumers will come and purchase those moss balls, and subsequent release can kind of take place after they've been purchased, flushed down the toilet, something along those lines, that this is maybe not as direct as a fish release or something directly into the pond. But it is something that is, like I say, unintentional, but it still has the same consequences of that. So I don't know, Colin, if you have any more details on the moss ball side of things, but that's my key example for that.
It's such a good one. I'm glad you brought it up, Jenna, because it's such a good kind of anecdote and example. And it rings true with some of the other things we've talked about too, just about the challenge of wrapping your head around how do these species in trade move, and how do you reach people in the event that you come to the realization that, in Canada, we were selling moss balls that happened to have, a priority aquatic invasive species, zebra mussels, as, just hitching a ride on these things. People weren't going to the store, of course, just there for zebra mussels. They were there just for what looked like a moss ball.
Can you take a second just to talk about how damaging zebra mussels are to the lake systems and the water systems? Because I don't know if this is everywhere, but in Manitoba, obviously in Ontario as well, pretty much every boat launch and everything you go to, there's going to be a sign about zebra mussels saying make sure you rinse things off and you're not transmitting them. So I know they do cause damage, but I'm not super familiar with it.
Oh yeah, and I'm glad in kind of central and western Canada they haven't had that same experience, because they came in through the Great Lakes, became well established, moved from the Great Lakes into kind of those secondary and tertiary tributaries of connected lakes through the cottage countries and so on. And in terms of reasons why they're bad, the quick version is they are plentiful. They outcompete native mussels. And even if you weren't aware that your lake had mussels, once infested with zebra mussels, and once they become established, very quickly you realize that these things can get out of hand quickly. They attach themselves to basically anything in the water, boat hulls, docks, rocks, you name it, anything that's underwater that seems like a good surface they can attach to, they'll find their way. And the real challenge is that, there's a few, but just from a recreational perspective, trying to use your lake, they are great at cutting up your feet, something awful. So if you're just trying to walk in or walk out, all of a sudden, basically, water shoes become a must. And it just really impacts, just from a personal perspective, how do we use our water? How do we recreate in that system? From other perspectives too, they've been really adept at finding their way and clogging water intake pipes. So if our municipality is responsible for treating our water, usually they'll have intake pipes that would go pretty deep underwater into a water body. They would take that water and treat it, and then distribute it through municipal water systems. Well, those intake pipes become clogged up real quick. Once zebra mussels come in, there's some great photos online that you can see just about how very quickly a 24-inch diameter pipe turns into a 6-inch diameter pipe, just because of how many layers and layers and layers of zebra mussels kind of build on each other and clog those pipes. So why does that matter? What's the big deal? Well, unfortunately, those are extremely expensive pieces of municipal infrastructure to replace and maintain. So the cost of these things, becomes real and hits municipal taxpayers pretty quickly. So whether it's you just trying to use your water body and walk into the water, or you just as, somebody who has skin in the game as a taxpayer, zebra mussels can become a pretty big deal pretty quickly. And I would say they're quite widely established across the province of Ontario and certainly into Quebec as well, moving east. But really the kind of leading edge of the invasion is generally somewhere in Manitoba. And I would say Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in particular have done a really great job at trying to hold that line. And, they've done all sorts of great mitigation programs and have programs in place, whether it's, boat inspection stations. If you're moving your boat throughout the province on the highway on the long weekend, heading to the cottage or camp, usually that's one of the most important functions of those watercraft inspection stations, pulling in. And some of them, even in Alberta, they've got zebra mussel sniffing dogs that they'll give you a little walk around your boat and have a look for them. And the reason is because it doesn't take many zebra mussels to move on a boat hull that's just pulled out of the one lake this day and going into another lake the next day, and maybe moving hundreds of kilometers. And it just doesn't take much for those things to become established. So a really important feature. And boating is a great example of a pathway they've moved around. But back to Jenna's point there about the moss balls, I'll stop being so long-winded about it, but that's really another key pathway there, is just this kind of unintentional movement of the species around through moss balls back in 21.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then how quickly things get out of hand. And, when a species finds a niche in this new environment, it's almost like a wildfire that you can't stop. And as far as I think it's actually like a crime to release animals into the wilderness or into the wild. And so maybe one of you could talk about how severe of a crime is it? And is there a difference between intentional and unintentional? Like, could you get in trouble for unintentionally bringing zebra mussels into a new lake, or how does that work? Is there a differentiation there?
Yeah, there's a few kind of key pathways and regulations, I guess, that we've generally seen be used to try and approach this. There's federal and provincial law. So it kind of differs a little bit depending on where you are and where you're listening from. There are federal regulations that are specific to aquatic invasive species. So a species like a zebra mussel or quagga mussel or other invasive mussels are kind of essentially on a list that said, thou shalt not move, thou shalt not purchase and distribute these. So we've got some regulatory backstops there just from a national level, which are really helpful tools. And then there's other kind of maybe more specific examples, I guess, of where other invasive species mitigation regulations can come into play. So as I said before about kind of moving watercraft, that would be another great example of, those are built into provincial regulations generally about what do you need to do when you pull a watercraft out of a water body and you're going to move it to another one and transport it over land. There's steps that you need to take. You need to pull the drain plug on your boat. You need to make sure that any visible plant material that you can see is removed off. You need to take those clean, drain, and dry steps, which are generally just kind of the key wording there on how do we do that. And every province regulates a different group of species depending on, regionally and locally what's most important. Some of the usual suspects on those provincial regulation lists would be things like invasive mussels, zebra mussels. So that's one of the reasons why we tend to hear a lot about them. But there's other species too, like mystery snail, which would have a hobbyist link into aquarium keeping as well. Red swamp crayfish would be another example of a species that's regulated from a provincial perspective in a number of provinces, and that would be one that comes in and moves around through the live food pathway. So, maybe it's not going to be hitchhiking in your live well in your boat, but there's other kind of means and mechanisms these things move around. So there's other regulations that kind of target other species too beyond that. And there's other federal regulations too. If we think about, what's the role of a federal border in stopping species from coming in. And so, there's kind of a wide array, I guess, of different provincial and federal regs, and even some municipal bylaws too that are designed to stop a variety of pathways from these invasive species from moving around. How serious they are? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, even if you think that you're doing this innocent thing by, dumping a goldfish into the pond, if you got caught by a CO or something doing that, you actually could get in trouble, and you could face, a ticket of some sort, and something that you probably don't even realize could happen.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there are ticketable offenses, no doubt. If you blew past a watercraft inspection station, they will come after you and provide a hefty ticket for what you've done. So it kind of depends, I guess, based on the regulation and the infraction. I would say generally, in my experience across, federally and provincially, is we really try and work on that education first opportunity. And so trying to make sure people, generally people do the right thing, right? If you can help them understand why these regulations and rules are in place, generally people do the right thing. Back to that education importance, I guess, of people not releasing. So generally people do the right thing, but there are regulatory backstops in place that include pretty hefty fines, in some cases hundreds of dollars, in some cases thousands of dollars. Some provinces even have the ability to charge you on a per individual release basis. So if you release 1,000 Asian carp into Lake Ontario, there's pretty hefty fines when they add up on 1,000 of them. So, it varies by region, but generally speaking, we're really trying to do the education approach first. But absolutely, there are many examples of people being ticketed and fined for aquatic invasive species related infractions.
Yeah. So as you, obviously both of you are working in this space, so you see the damage that's done to the environment and whatnot. So I thought, as far as your personal thoughts on pet keeping goes, does it make you more pessimistic towards pet keeping and wishing people didn't, or what are your thoughts there? Maybe we'll start with Jenna.
Yeah,
and don't be afraid to say you hate pet keeping. It's
okay.
No.
No, I think, I think pet keeping is really valuable. I think it kind of garners an appreciation for, animals. And I think that kind of can translate to wildlife and to other, spaces. And so I think I don't think that pet keeping itself is really the issue. It's responsibility to ensure that you see your pet through it to the end of its life. Is kind of what we're trying to achieve here. And I do think that, like I say, pet keeping does have its merit. It grows this appreciation, and you're more willing to kind of help out in settings where it's possible. As you mentioned, kind of this is something that your audience and experienced pet keepers are the ones who are going to be teaching less experienced pet keepers. And I think that this is really important to have an appreciation for the pets themselves. So I do think that pet keeping is valuable. Like I say, just as long as there's a responsibility that comes along with it. Yeah, Colin, I don't
exactly.
know. Yeah.
And what about yourself, Colin?
Yeah, I mean, Jenna said it perfectly. I think just to build on it a little bit more, I'd say something I'm kind of keeping an eye on more recently is just, how is COVID impacting our lives in this space as well? How many new keepers are coming into these hobbies, whether it's pet keeping or whether it's, any number of other hobbies too, right? It's just we're at a point in time, I think, where there's new audiences and new people coming into the fold, and how can we support maybe their more thoughtful integration into our communities more broadly in terms of sharing our knowledge, sharing our best practices, and creating a safe and welcoming space for them to realize the impacts of some of their decisions. It's a really important kind of time, I think, for us broadly, I guess, and how we're impacting our environment. But Jenna said it perfectly, just about the importance, I think, from my perspective here is just how can we do these activities ethically and understand the consequences of maybe what some of those not as ideal choices would be, and just bring more people into the fold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can certainly be an incredibly rich experience, and it connects people with nature and gives you more of appreciation for, if you live in a city, you may not even have access to a forest right away, but you could have something like that in your room and appreciate it that way. But at the same time, we do need to make sure it's done responsibly. And I can imagine if you're focused on invasive species, it would be very easy to become very disenchanted with the idea of people keeping pets because, they get out and whatnot. But I'm glad to hear that too. But it does come down to the pet keepers and the communities that are, advocating for this group of people keeping animals, that we're doing it ethically and responsibly. And one area, I can't remember if we talked about this in our prep call a couple months ago, or if this is just an idea that I had, but outdoor cats, because this is maybe, is this something Colin brought up? I can't remember, but this is maybe could be classified as an invasive species, right? These are an animal that's living on the landscape, and they are doing some damage. So is my memory, did this something I just came up with on my own, or did we talk about this before?
It comes up often. I don't remember if it came up from us, but it's a conversation we have often. And it's, the tricky thing for me is that there is no ironclad list of species that are invasive or are not. We have some level of subjectivity involved in what is an invasive species and what isn't. There are many obvious examples. And then there are other examples that are maybe a little bit more nuanced. And this is one that would fit into me as more in that gray area, more in that nuance. Are there negative consequences that species like feral cats can have, or outdoor cats? Absolutely. And there's some great resources out there on the impact that cats, as an example, could have on bird populations. Really important and meaningful roles there. I would say it's not a species that we've worked on a lot in the past, but absolutely, I think there's some good evidence there to support, really, really thoughtful approaches, I guess, to keeping cats or outdoor cats. And it's true for kind of any pet species. I think when we start to keep them outside, that's when some of those challenges and those interactions with the natural systems can become maybe problematic. So it's a good one to dig into a little bit more.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating topic. So I think, the initiative Don't Let It Loose campaign is really focused on sort of proactive approach, as we said, and that's easily the cheapest and the easiest of the options. But as we've already mentioned, invasive species do become a problem, and it snowballs very quickly. So, for example, the zebra mussels, I think I'll put some pictures of zebra mussels in the video version, and anybody else that's listening on audio, just Google it, because as Colin said, it's just sort of insane to see how many zebra mussels are, on these boat hauls and docks and whatnot. So what do we do? Like, once the cat is out of the bag, what are some of the invasive species management? I'm not sure if the Invasive Species Centre is involved in any of that management once it's already happened, or what do we do next?
It's so tricky, right? I think generally when it comes to management, what we're implying there when we're talking about managing a species is that it's become well established, and it's no longer just a couple individuals. It might no longer be just restricted to one lake. It might be more, widely distributed across a watershed or across a region or across a province or nationally. So, the tricky thing is that costs escalate substantially, of course, when we're talking about how widely established things are. And really, there is an opportunity. There's a kind of point in time where we lose that cost effectiveness to manage those species. If we catch them early, that is when we have high return on investment here, and it's absolutely worthwhile to us engage in a strong fashion. When things become really widely established, you do reach a point where unfortunately no really strong management or control activity can be feasible from a broad perspective. Things become established nationally. Are we going to eradicate them entirely? That would be really challenging. There's a few examples of eradication projects that happen at scale. Alberta's got a long-standing rat eradication program it's really interesting. There's not a lot of examples of it, but it does happen sometimes. And so you can turn back the clock in a sense, but really the cost effectiveness argument is not on your side in the majority of cases. And so it's a bit of a challenge in terms of what management tools and techniques are on the table. Some of them can be really strong and have other consequences well beyond just the invasive species you're managing. And so that becomes another consideration. So we talked before about that goldfish example in St. Albert, Alberta, and just rotenone being the response that was chosen in that example. Great benefits for the pond or the water body, in terms of an angling and stocking perspective. But to be quite transparent, there's also other negative consequences to other species that would use that habitat as well. Like I said it kind of casually before, but hitting reset in a sense on a system like that is a really impactful set of management decisions that really should be explored with a high degree of caution. So
it's kind of like treating cancer with chemotherapy. You're going to get rid of the cancer, but you're going to take a lot of live tissue out with it as well. And that's just part of the collateral damage. And you don't want to use that tool unless you absolutely have to.
Exactly. So an important tool in the toolbox to have in consideration for some circumstances. But yeah, exactly. Use sparingly, use with great caution, use with great respect to kind of provincial and federal regulations and safety checks that are in place to make sure that any management decision that's very heavy like that would be done in an appropriate set of conditions. So there's, it depends on the species you're managing, but things like chemical control, are one option. With aquatic plants in particular, sometimes we'll see manual or physical removal. So you might see kind of like a combine harvester, like a grain combine that would be out floating on the water. It's not the same piece of equipment, but just to kind of paint the image in people's minds, it's effectively that, and just scooping up aquatic plants, putting them on a conveyor belt, and then dumping them back into a barge. So, that would be another example, I guess, really expensive things that of course aren't on the table for every condition. But sometimes it's just a hand pulling too, if we have the right set of conditions. So, these are some of the management techniques and interventions we have to use or we can use when the conditions are right. It's tough to say. It just kind of depends on how much of it, what is the taxa, what are the life history traits that it uses, and how can we most effectively achieve the goal of eradication or containment.
Is there any examples in Canada of the government or organizations incentivizing people to go out into the landscape and pull animals? I mean, in Florida, we see that with the Burmese python. I think if you are a certified python hunter, you can you bring them into the government and they give you money for what you've gotten or what you're able to, call out of the environment. Do we have any similar things like that, or is there any incentivized for hunters to go and if you see a red ear slider to grab it or something like that?
Yeah, we're not. I mean, we're generally, to my knowledge, in kind of going through the Rolodex of case studies that we have access to recently, we haven't seen that. I would say that that's usually a conversation that comes up when we're talking about wild boar or invasive pigs, Eurasian wild boar, or just escaped wild pigs. And so usually that's a conversation that some perspectives will raise as, well, why don't we go and hunt them, or why can't we put a price per head effectively? And, one of the challenges with that mentality with respect to that particular species is that, unfortunately, there's a well-developed literature that says that that's probably the worst thing you can do is going out and hunting them just because you scatter them, that you basically break up a large cluster of them. And I'm not the wild pig expert, but the literature is very clear that this is not a strong management intervention if your goal here is to eradicate the species. So I would say it's a management intervention or a program model that could be used in the right conditions for the right species. We just maybe haven't had that, at least currently, in play. But in terms of how do we support people going out and taking direct action, absolutely there's stuff that we can do and we are doing. The Invasive Species Centre had a micro grant round that just closed to kind of support community action. So it's not a lot of money, but there are 2 streams, one for $1,000 and one for $5,000 that we can do to support kind of very community-led and community-engaged style projects. So it might be pulling garlic mustard or invasive plants in the landscape, or it might be kind of working with your community to do other direct action projects. So it would be an example, not in the same model of price per head, but how can we enable and support community action? There are a couple examples. We'd love to see more. We'd definitely love to see more people out on the landscape doing more work, because really that's where we see great value in supporting community-led initiative. Love to see more, but we just haven't had that yet. So look forward to maybe a 2022 micro grant round coming out. So yeah, keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, and I guess with plants, it's easier because it's safer for people to go and collect them from, their environment around them. And in some ways, when you think about trying to eradicate an invasive species of plant, for example, it seems like an impossible task because, you pull the plants out, but are there seeds scattered? Who knows? But if you have people doing it consistently and you have the community the knowledge to know that when you see this type of plant, it's actually invasive, so feel free to just pluck it out of the ground, that actually probably does a lot of work cumulatively over decades. It's
true. And I mean, the advantage of the plants too is they're staying still mostly. So that helps, right? But yeah, when some of these things, wild boars are running around, for instance, or wild pigs, it's maybe a little bit more of a moving target. But it's not to say that it's not a great example. I'm loosely familiar with that example you cited about the Everglades and Burmese python. And certainly seems to be an interesting model. We just haven't had the right conditions for that being applied here, but really intrigued at it being a creative approach, right? When you get a scaled problem or challenge or opportunity, I guess at that size, you need to look to other models to try and find solutions there. So glad that it seems to be working, or at least the parts of it are certainly working from a program perspective for their situation.
Yeah, it's kind of like trying to manage COVID at this point. You can't reel it back in. We can't eradicate it. And it seemed like at the beginning, maybe that's what we thought. But at this point, it's just like we got to learn different management styles. And it's the same thing with an invasive species that just becomes ubiquitous. Like earthworms, how are you ever going to get rid of earthworms? It's just going to be impossible.
It's true, right? And so that, I think that's the pivot point that we have is trying to look at, what is your management outcome? What does your end state look like? Are we trying to put the genie back in the bottle in a sense with the earthworm example? Well, probably not. Unfortunately, we don't have the management intervention steps and tools that would enable us to do that. And even if we did, it's such a scaled project or problem or challenge that it might be difficult and unreasonable to try and do that. And so, that's really where we try and focus in on, okay, well, can we stop the further spread by just, small interventions, by maybe putting a sticker or a label on a bait, earthworm package. If the conditions are right, perhaps banning live bait as a pathway, if that would help prevent subsequent or further spread. Or are there new species that could come in through that pathway that we want to stop? Even if the goal here isn't to kind of stop all live bait, but we're really concerned about new species being introduced through that pathway, maybe that's where that set of conditions. But you're absolutely right. And I think we're constantly learning here about how can we adapt and refine and do a little bit better. And also there's new species that are potentially threatening or in a more meaningful way threatening us constantly. So keeping on our toes, trying to be adaptive. We've learned lots of lessons, unfortunately, over the last couple of years with COVID. But I think the principles are in some ways the same there, just about being responsive and adaptive and just trying to keep in mind what is your end state, what is your end condition that you're trying to manage towards, and keep trying to take steps in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think from the pet keeper side, there's so much that can be done to just make sure the education is there, and make sure people understand that you can't do this, how bad it is for the environment, and that, make sure that there's a place for those animals to go. As we said, as far as the ethical thing, people don't want to kill their animal or euthanize their animal, totally understandable, but make sure there's pathways for them to move those animals into different homes and different captive environments so we don't continue to contribute to these sort of environmental disasters that we want to get in front of that. And that's why I love this conversation. That's, the podcast, the foundation of this podcast is ethical and responsible reptile keeping or animal keeping and pet keeping in general. And this is a huge aspect of it. And as I said, in Florida, we've seen these places get out of control, and we want to make sure it's just another arrow in our quiver, or whatever that the saying is, to stay on top of things and to make sure that this is another area that we can focus on and make sure that we're actually doing the right things. is there anything left unsaid? Did we kind of cover everything, or is there any other things that you guys wanted to mention before we wrap up?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. And you're right. It's a vast topic. So appreciate you kind of going with us on a few tangents here, but glad to see it all kind of come together here, talking about the topic more broadly. Just a quick plug, if I could, for if you're interested in learning a little bit more, our website's got a lot of great information up on it, species profiles, just some information on organisms and trade more broadly as well, and kind of what can be done under this Don't Let It Loose guidance there. And so it's www.invasivespeciescentre.ca. Center is with an RE because we're based in Canada. And just appreciate the conversation very much, Dylan.
Yeah, I absolutely had a blast chatting with you too. Is there anything left from your side, Jenna?
Oh, that was great. I really, really enjoyed speaking with you today. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much both to joining me on the podcast. And I hope this is the beginning of that, the side of responsible keeping when it comes to releasing the pets. Like I said, for many people listening to the podcast, they know not to do it, but we forget that people don't know not to do that. And it should be up to us to make sure that we're educating people and giving the space for unwanted animals to come back into the captive fold under our care. So I thank you so much for the work that you've done and the initiatives that you're starting, as well as joining me on the podcast today. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Colin and Jenna, thank you so much for joining me and reminding us of the really important piece that we play in this Don't Let It Loose campaign. Invasive species are a massive problem. They disrupt ecosystems incredibly aggressively. I mean, anybody that is watching the YouTube video will have seen the videos and the clips and the pictures of the zebra mussels. If you're listening to it on audio, just Google zebra mussel infestation and you will see how insane these populations get in a very, very quick amount of time. And of course, all of that is not associated with the pet hobby, but as Colin and Jenna mentioned, moss balls can be bringing in these animals and these organisms into the natural habitats, and that's something that we want to watch for. Red-eared sliders are obviously a problem in the States. We know that reptiles are a problem. It's not always associated with the pet hobby, but it can be associated with the pet hobby, and as responsible keepers, we need to make sure that we're promoting that message. Do not let your animals loose into the wild. It can cause a horrible amount of damage. It is better for us to reabsorb that back into captivity, into a new home. So thank you so much for the listeners. Thank you to Colin and Jenna for joining me. If you're looking for more information on this episode, head to animalsathome.network.com. There you'll find all the show notes for every episode that has ever been recorded. If you'd like to join us on Patreon, head to patreon.com/animalsathome. Again, thank you to customreptilehabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. And as I said in the intro, we have an exciting video planned sometime in the spring. So if you're not subscribed on YouTube, make sure you go watch that or subscribe now so you don't miss that video. Very excited to share that with you. And the other thing I mentioned in the intro is that, yes, the baby was born. Everything is going great. Sleeping and schedule is sort of up in the air all the time. I'm going to try to get back to my every Sunday schedule, but it may end up me being where I just end up producing an episode every 7 to 10 days, and I don't worry about getting it out every Sunday. I just might post episodes during the middle of the week just so they're getting out and sort of editing when I have time. But we'll see how that goes. For now, I have one recorded for this Sunday that you're listening to right now, and hopefully one for next Sunday as well. That one's already recorded. It just needs to be edited. And I think I will start yammering on and on at this point. Thank you so much for listening to the episode, and I will catch you guys next Sunday, hopefully, and if not next Sunday, sometime during that week, the episode will be live.